Tonight, the alarming COVID-19 surge in America. Multiple states reporting their highest single-day spikes in new cases. Arizona, Florida, South Carolina, and in Texas, hospitalizations at a facility in one major city soaring 40%. The state's now hitting pause on reopening, and the clash between mayors and governors. Do they speed up or slow down? The new CDC guidelines for returning to everyday life, the precautions that they're advising you take to stay safe at restaurants, hotels, even summer cookouts. President Trump speaking out on police reform, his new message on chokeholds. Should they be banned? And what he said that's raising eyebrows about Abraham Lincoln. The president also just hours away from traveling to West Point. 1,000 cadets brought back and quarantined in order to hear him speak at graduation. And his new reaction after the nation's top general apologized for appearing in his church photo op. The standoff in Seattle, protesters taking over multiple city blocks. The police precinct boarded up, not an officer in sight. The new threat to move the protesters out by force. And the video inspiring America, the whole neighborhood coming out to surprise an everyday hero.
This is NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt.
Good evening, everyone. An alarming rise in COVID-19 cases and hospitalizations in this country tonight, rudely reminding us this virus is making its own rules, now having remarkably claimed more than 115,000 lives in this country in under 4 months. A serious spike in cases in more than a dozen states, making for some gut check moments in places straining to further reopen. Some officials pressing forward despite the numbers, while others tonight prepare to hold tight a little longer. Morgan Chesky leads off our coverage.
Tonight, rising concerns as a surge of new COVID-19 cases hit multiple states.
No one wants to slow down the opening of the economy if there's any way to avoid it. And we are in the any way to avoid it stage.
In Texas, a month after opening back up, hospital space is available. But at Houston Methodist, patients are up 40%.
I think people have let their guard down.
President Trump himself criticized after photos from last night's Dallas visit showed a packed church with few masks and limited social distancing. When you saw that picture of the president's meeting last night, what was your initial reaction?
I was angry because that's our commander-in-chief. That's the person who's supposed to be leading the effort to keep you alive in the time of COVID.
In South Carolina, the governor lifting restrictions despite seeing the single largest daily increase in cases since the pandemic began. 14 states showing a greater than 25% increase in cases in the last week. Recent spikes now prompting some areas to press pause. Nashville staying in phase 2 as both Utah and Oregon take similar steps.
This is essentially a statewide yellow light. This one-week pause will give our public health experts time to assess what factors are driving the spread of the virus and determine if we need to adjust our approach to reopening.
If she makes that decision, there's a reason she's making that decision, and I have to trust that.
Nationwide, the virus still hitting familiar hotspots. This California nursing home evacuated early this morning after an outbreak forced nearly every resident to relocate. And in Oklahoma, Whirlpool announcing it's closing its plant in Tulsa, where the virus just hit a new daily peak. The company's saying exposed workers have been quarantined. And with each COVID-19 case in the plant, there is a thorough investigation that includes contact tracing. The rush to reopen now forcing a face-off between local and state leaders. In New Jersey, where cases have stabilized, the governor's suing the city of Asbury Park after local leaders violated his order not to allow indoor dining.
We have one set of rules, and they are based on one principle, and that is ensuring public health.
Back in Texas, it's the mayors pushing for a slowdown. But Governor Greg Abbott's order means full steam ahead towards a full reopening.
The state has preempted local governments from hitting the brakes. What we have is our voice and providing information and monitoring the situation.
Now, we did reach out to Texas Governor Greg Abbott today. His office says that despite this uptick in numbers, Texas has increased its testing, like these drive-through sites, by more than 200% since May. They went on to say that nationwide, Texas has one of the lowest death rates for COVID-19. Lester?
All right, Morgan Chesky tonight starting us off. Thanks. And the CDC said today it now expects up to 140,000 deaths from coronavirus by July 4th. This as it issued new guidelines on what Americans should do every day to prevent the spread of the virus. Let's get more now from Tom Costello.
With Americans eager to resume their normal lives, the CDC is out with a long-awaited list of guidelines while reiterating advice to avoid large crowds, wash hands, social distance, and wear masks. Having friends over? Host them outdoors if you can. Separate seating and avoid sharing condiments and salad dressings. Staying at a hotel? Take the stairs. Avoid elevators unless it's just you and your family. Eating out? Call first to make sure the waiters are wearing masks. No advice on attending protests, political rallies, or going to church.
In the coming weeks, we could see increases in the number of cases of COVID-19 as states reopen and as there's an increase in public gatherings.
Today's briefing was over the phone, not on camera. Amid the worst pandemic in 100 years, neither the CDC nor the Coronavirus Task Force has briefed the nation on camera since April 27th, 48 days ago. Members of Congress have been asking questions.
I am alarmed that this administration has sidelined the CDC in our response to the pandemic and chosen political expediency over public health.
This week, reporters asked the White House press secretary what happened to the task force briefings.
Is there any thought being given to returning to, if not a daily coronavirus briefing, frequent coronavirus briefings?
New cases have stabilized, and many of the new cases are being identified through proactive monitoring and finding asymptomatic cases.
The White House says the task force is still meeting, but with the death toll still climbing, a former CDC director says the public needs regular updates.
These are the world's best experts in how to stop a disease like COVID. We need to hear from these experts at least every week.
Meanwhile, a CDC report indicates the U.S. had a 36% increase in daily cases between June 6th and 9th, while other countries had a decline, including Britain, Germany, Italy, and Spain. Lester?
Tom Costello tonight. Thanks. President Trump said today he'll soon issue an executive order on police reform, and he weighed in on the use of chokeholds by police. Kristen Welker has late details.
Tonight, President Trump revealing one aspect of police reform he might support, signaling he's open to a ban on officers using chokeholds, but also voicing reservations in a Fox News interview.
I think the concept of chokeholds sounds so innocent, so perfect, and then you realize if it's a one-on-one, now if it's two-on-one, that's a little bit of a different story, depending. But if a police officer is in a bad scuffle and he's got somebody.
Well, if it's a one-on-one fight for the life.
Yeah, and that does happen. And that does happen too. So you have to be careful. With that being said, it would be, I think, a very good thing that, generally speaking, it should be ended.
The president saying he's close to finalizing an executive order that would improve police training, but has yet to offer specifics. And he was asked what he would say to protesters about George Floyd's death.
I think it's a shame. I think it's a disgrace, and it's got to stop. At the same time, you also know that we have incredible people in law enforcement, and we have to cherish them and take care of them. And we can't let something like this, where you have a bad apple, go out and, destroy the image of of millions of people that take really good care of us.
The president is grappling with how to address the concerns of protesters, with some advisors telling NBC News they're worried he is only focused on his base. The president at times heard saying of the protesters, "These aren't my voters," according to 3 people familiar with the comments. Responding to our report, a White House official saying, quote, "The president doesn't see the protesters as directly about him," which is accurate. It's a result of decades of racism in our country. Meanwhile, after criticism of his upcoming rally in Tulsa on the anniversary of the end of slavery, the president says the date was not chosen on purpose.
It wasn't done for that reason, but it's an interesting date, but it's a celebration.
Later, touting his record, invoking Abraham Lincoln.
I think I've done more for the black community than any other president, and let's take a pass on Abraham Lincoln because he did good, although it's always questionable. In other words, the end result.
Well, we are free, Mr. President.
But we are
did
free.
Pretty well.
You understand what I mean?
Yeah, no,
so I'm going to take a pass on Honest Abe, as we call it.
But you say you've done more than anybody.
Well, look, criminal justice reform. Nobody else could have done it. I did it.
And tonight, the RNC announcing it's moving the Republican convention to Jacksonville. The president pulled the event from Charlotte, where the governor had required social distancing guidelines. Lester.
Kristen Welker at the White House. Thanks. The president also weighing in on the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who apologized for appearing in that recent church photo op. It comes just hours before the president travels to West Point for its commencement. Here's Courtney Cubie.
Tonight, President Trump responding after chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Mark Milley, apologized for being at that controversial photo op outside the White House.
I think it was a beautiful picture.
Why do you
And I'll tell you, I think Christians think it was a beautiful picture.
Thursday, General Milley said his participation gave the appearance he was involved in domestic politics. 3 defense officials telling NBC News he discussed resigning. And it came after Defense Secretary Esper also publicly disagreed with the president.
If that's the way they feel, I think that's fine. I have good relationships with the military. I've rebuilt our military.
Now the commander-in-chief is set to make the traditional trip to West Point's graduation, one that will look much different than last year's. Returning cadets are being tested and separated into groups. 18 tested positive for coronavirus and had to be isolated. All asymptomatic, they are now cleared to graduate tomorrow.
Unlike previous years, this year's ceremony will be held here, on the plane at West Point. And the graduates, their family and friends will be watching online.
I envision lieutenants coming out of those sally ports right there with their mask on.
I think making the commencement speech, I'm doing it at West Point, which I look forward to.
Critics accuse the president of making cadets return to campus.
Forcing all of these cadets, 1,000 of them, into a single location just so the president can speak at them is really a failure of his role as commander-in-chief.
But Army leaders insist the event was planned all along.
The decision was made by the Secretary of the Army, Secretary McCarthy, with my best military advice. And my advice to the Secretary was that the United States Military Academy should have a graduation.
We're happy that he's coming.
And cadets told us they're thrilled.
I get to say class dismissed, and we're all throwing our hats up, and it's going to be a great day.
The newest members of the Long Gray Line. Courtney Cubie, NBC News, West Point, New York.
After yesterday's big sell-off, Wall Street bounced back today. The Dow gaining almost 500 points, just short of 2%. Still, it was Wall Street's worst week since March. We'll take a short break in 60 seconds. The standoff in Seattle. Protesters take over 4 city blocks. What the president is threatening to do to take them back. In Seattle, a group of protesters have taken over 4 city blocks, driving the police out. Now the president is threatening military action to take the area back. With more, here's Jolene Kent.
In Seattle's hip Capitol Hill neighborhood, the East Police Precinct has a new name. It's a symbol of the dramatic transformation triggered by more than a week of violent clashes with tear gas and flashbangs between police and protesters, calling for an end to police brutality in the name of George Floyd.
What do you hope to tell the world out here as you protest?
I just want justice, and we just want it now.
In an unexpected move this week, police boarded up and left the East Precinct, hoping protesters would disperse, but they stayed, creating the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, or CHAZ, over several city blocks to gather, paint murals, and plant gardens without a cop in sight. However peaceful, the scene here prompting President Trump to threaten military action again today, calling protesters terrorists.
We're not going to let this happen in Seattle. If we have to go in, we're going to go in. The governor's either going to do it. Let the governor do it. He's got great National Guard troops. He can do it. But one way or the other, it's going to get done.
While the zone remains peaceful, the police chief, who was the first black woman to lead the department, is now concerned their absence from the area is threatening public safety.
Our 911 response times have tripled in the area. They've gone from just over 5 minutes to about 18 minutes for the really important calls that we're responding to.
As the zone grows, police say they plan to return, promising something will change.
When I look at you, I see my own family members right in your face, right? So it is time for us to have dialogue and have change, and I'm all for it.
Jolene Kent, NBC News, Seattle.
The push for police reform took a step forward today in Louisville, the city banning so-called no-knock warrants after the death of Breonna Taylor. Now there's an effort to ban them nationally. Gabe Gutierrez now with more on the controversial practice.
Today, Louisville's mayor signed Breonna's law after the Metro Council unanimously banned the use of no-knock warrants, a controversial practice that gives police authority to enter a home without announcing themselves. In March, Breonna Taylor and her boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, were asleep in her apartment when 3 police officers arrived with a narcotics search warrant. Lawyers for Taylor's family say the couple was startled when the officers in plain clothes entered the home. Police say the officers did announce themselves, but Taylor's family disputes that. Walker says he thought it was a home invasion and opened fire with his licensed handgun, injuring an officer. The 3 officers returned fire, killing Taylor.
Somebody kicked in the door and shot my girlfriend.
Breonna was not involved in any drug activity, so they had no reason to be at her apartment that night.
A newly released police incident report is mostly blank. It says there was no forced entry, and under injuries it says none, even though Taylor was shot 8 times. Republican Kentucky Senator Rand Paul is now introducing federal legislation to ban no-knock warrants nationwide.
In the case of Breonna Taylor, they had a warrant for that house, but they didn't accuse her or the boyfriend of being drug dealers.
It's estimated they're used 20,000 times each year.
They typically tend to be deployed in situations like drug raids where that element of surprise is really necessary and you're really concerned about the possibility of the destruction of evidence.
Taylor was an EMT. She saved lives for a living. Her family hopes that her death will save more.
It's amazing that people are listening, people are saying her name and learning who she was.
The officers involved in Taylor's death have been placed on administrative reassignment pending an ongoing investigation. The police department has declined to comment. Lester?
All right, Gabe, thanks very much. Coming up as we continue Pride and Protest, the parallels of 2 movements in this season of change. June is Pride Month, and some who were there when the movement began note that today's calls for change sound very familiar. Here's Joe Fryer.
Pride Month started this year not with a parade, but with protests in front of New York's iconic Stonewall Inn. In contrast to the celebration at Stonewall last June when we met Reverend Goddess Kennedy.
It's the young people that have to carry on after we're gone. It's important that the young folks know the history of Stonewall.
Kennedy was there in June of '69 when police raided Stonewall, something that happened a lot at gay bars. But this time, the crowd fought back, sparking protests that lasted several nights. Vital to the uprising, queer and trans people of color, including Marsha P. Johnson. Because of coronavirus, we spoke by phone with Reverend Kennedy, who can't help but think of Stonewall as she watches today's protests.
This is finally a time when people are realizing that we're really all in this together.
The very first Pride took place on the 1-year anniversary of Stonewall, but it was nothing like the energetic parades we've grown accustomed to. It was a protest march.
And so the Pride parades grew out of a protest that was a result of violence, police-induced violence. And we had to remember that.
This year, Pride festivities across the country were put on hold because of coronavirus. But now, in the wake of George Floyd's death, LA Pride is holding a solidarity protest on the same streets they marched on 50 years ago, raising some of the same issues.
Until we get this right, we will continue to come back to this place.
A banner hanging outside Stonewall last week said Pride is a riot. A reminder not just where Pride began, but why. Joe Fryer, NBC News.
Up next, the inspiring act of kindness for a neighborhood hero.
Inspiring America is brought to you by Liberty Mutual Insurance. Only pay for what you need.
Finally, we want to share with you the surprise for an everyday hero who has helped keep the neighborhood going during this tough time. Katie Beck with the video Inspiring America.
UPS driver Greg Watkins is often greeted by people waiting for him, but never before like this.
I don't know what to say. It's an amazing surprise.
Customers are grateful for deliveries, but on this day, appreciation waits for Watkins, who's been bringing boxes to doorsteps on these streets for over a decade.
You're an essential worker, but you've always been essential to us.
In this Long Island, New York neighborhood, the father of 4 has found an extended family.
He is completely genuine. He does everything from his heart, not because it's his job. He does it because he really cares about people.
The pandemic brought difficult months at home full of unwelcome change, but Watkins stayed steady, a source of joy, arriving right on time. Now, a return to sender.
It's a pleasure to be in this area and just to get to know everybody here. I'm watching your kids grow. I'm watching them start to drive.
A surprise delivery for Watkins from a community that wants him to know what being essential really means. Katie Beck, NBC News.
What a great outpouring. That is Nightly News for this Friday. Please join me tomorrow for a special Dateline investigation into the coronavirus pandemic, the playbook to stop it, and what went wrong. 8 p.m. Eastern, 7 Central here on NBC. I'm Lester Holt. Please take care of yourself and each other. Good night.